The petty bourgeois Enrique Semo. Since the 1960s, Enrique Semo has promulgated for a statist socialism, a relentless despot socialism. This socialism, at present the bureaucratic layer obtains its income among other things from the borrowings of the banks, often Jewish banking, to the government. Semo was a member of the Central Committee of the Mexican Communist Party for 17 years. Active participant in the reforms of the period 1960 to 1981 that include the education and training of cadres through meetings of the Central Committee and the cadre schools, the independence of the Soviet Union and the CPSU from the policy of the Mexican Communists, the integration of the PCM into institutional political electoral life, the determined construction of the unity of the left, the full insertion of the PCM in a period of rise of the country's democracy. As a citizen who was born in a semi-civilized country, who grew up in a country where with a system of hydraulic despotism, it is normal for him to advocate deepening, for enlarging the power of the state. We'll look at this later. Obviously also that his proposals are of little use since they follow the opposite of Karl Marx's recommendations for the development of nations. We repeat, Enrique Semo's studies have always been the opposite of what Karl Marx recommended for the development of nations. The dependentist approach placed colonial and dependency relations at the center of history, emphasizing the growing struggles of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as well as the anti-colonial liberation movements that were beginning to assert themselves as the main bearers of change. The subject in that vision shifts from the industrial working class to the anti-colonialist, anti-racist and feminist movements and, ultimately, anti-systemic. Enrique Semo, La Conquista, Catástrofe de los Pueblos Originarios. It leaves aside the workers to join the populist anti-colonialist, racist and feminist policy. Semo's task has always been to stop the scarce development of the country that gave him shelter, under the name of socialism or communism. For Marx, the working class represented the vanguard by being the producer of value or surplus value, not by being a victim of something or by being poor. These last two words do not carry any virtue to coin a historical subject that changes society at its root. Populist is any person or movement that tries to stop the development of history, of the productive forces, whether in capitalism or at any other stage. Enrique Semo is racist against a special group of humans, those with white skin, whom he classifies as racists, being that he makes the derogatory distinction for the color of skin, whom he blames as the cause of all the evils of all human society. The supremacy of the Western white man over the Asian, African, and American peoples was established first and foremost by his military superiority, Mexican history, economy, and class struggle. For Karl Marx there was no such thing as the supremacy of the Western white man. He considered England, Germany, and then the United States role models, for that he wrote Capital, and his purpose is written in the first prologue of the first edition. Enrique Semo's racism is such that he accentuates it with the word Western to be more precise in his dirty perversion of the world, that is, he excludes Western Europeans, including Bulgaria, where he is from, Slavs, Russians, Orientals, etc. Marx never wrote of the racism of the Western white man, even though racism was more obvious at that time than Enrique Semo and other Marxists understand it. In no writing of Marx has been talking about racism, in none, much less of making the color of skin as the axis of theses or explanations to subjugate or denigrate humans as if Enrique Semo does. In Mexico, modernity is the transition from the colonial state to the independent national state, from the King of Spain to the Federal Republic, from the rhythm and landscape of the rider to that of the railway, from the cultural domain of the church and scholasticism to the lay world and the sciences, from tax despotism to the peasant mode of production, from the artisanal world, to the industrial world, from the racist contempt of the indigenous, to their assimilationist national integration, from the domination of liberalism and positivism to revolutionary nationalism, from the cult of the French to monumental Mexican muralism. A modernity always in motion, full of ambiguities and fleeting apparitions. However, as in a good underdeveloped country, all this happens in the middle of a game of mirrors in which the habit acquires a modern face and modernity is hidden in tradition. Such is the prejudice of the Jew Enrique Semo that in everything he sees racism, of the racist contempt of the indigenous. We repeat, in the works of Karl Marx, about Mexico or Latin America or the world does not come once the word racism or racist, it has nothing to do with Marx. In the harsh establishment of capitalism in England, in France, Germany, or in the United States or in any other country in the world, he never mentioned the moral condemnation of the term racist. This rather sounds to me to be part of the vocabulary of the lumpen proletariat, of that envious, cavillous, and vile lumpen. Of that own contempt between lower strata of different races or people of different skin color. Semo as a good Jew tries to whip one group of people against another. Sharpen knives between Western whites and everyone else. This is how they have been during their history. A good example to get rid of this kind of prejudice is the reading of two excellent books, Karl Marx's The Jewish Question and Are Jews a Race? By Karl Koski. So much is his obsession with this task of whipping up races or ethnic groups among themselves that he repeats again and again that there is a scientific racism directed against all conquered non-white peoples. The main trend, especially of the English and the followers of the English mode of production, is that it does not matter the color of skin or race but that they can contribute to the production, give the best of themselves. That is why in the United States 330 million people of all races, skin colors are suitable, where in fact the rules, forms of work, of government were established mainly by whites, repeating the successful case of England, but this time in America, and that is what the book Capital by Karl Marx is about, to reproduce the case of England or the United States in the nations. On the eve of the revolution, Mexico is a country invaded by foreign capital. Their sovereignty is conditional, its development follows the guidelines imposed on it by great American and English capital. Mexican history, economy and class struggle. We clarify that foreign capital brought civilization to Mexico, since the Mexicans themselves could not create the capital accumulation necessary to do so. Engels wrote that it is in the interest of his own development that Mexico be put in the future under the tutelage of the United States. I do not know why Semo complains. I do not think that Professor Semo Kalef's remarks are any more accurate than those of Engels or Marx. Already in 1966 the Israelite Enrique Semo defines that he will defend those who slow down the development of the productive forces, the small town and any other anti-capitalist or anarchist group such as peasants, shopkeepers, teachers, lumpen proletariats and other layers that he will adhere. Since 1965 in Mexico he has been repeating again and again that big Mexican capital and foreign capital are the enemies of the Mexican people, that is, he does not mention the small capitalists. Today he calls it neoliberalism, it's the same thing. Let's clarify, Karl Marx never opposed the development of capitalism, or never opposed big capital, whatever country it is. Never. If Marx lived today he would never oppose neoliberalism, perhaps a part of them, but only in his policy of reducing the country's population through birth control. But otherwise I would see no objection to the deployment of big foreign capital or the big national capital of a third world country. From its beginnings Enrique Semo begins to attack the big capitalists and defend the small. Here is an example. Foreign capital and big Mexican capital are not interested in the development of Chiapas and Oaxaca, just as English capitalism refrained from liquidating the underdevelopment of Ireland or Scotland for centuries, or American capital preserves large depressed areas within the United States. Revista Historia y Sociedad 103, 1966. Semo's ignorance is so great that he calls for foreign and English capitalism to develop Mexico uniformly. It is like accusing Monterrey that Cerralvo is behind in its development. A characteristic of capitalism is the concentration of the petty bourgeoisie, and its ideologues are in favor of dissolution, of dispersion. We said that Mexico is capitalist, not only because of its internal relations of production, but because it is part of the world capitalist system. This conception rests on the premise that in the contemporary world there are two economic systems, the capitalist and the socialist. This premise is quite childish for someone with so many PhDs. In addition, Henry greatly disappoints Marx to the state with the accumulation of capital, denounces the overaccumulation of capital, or the thesaurization of gold. It is known to every decent Marxist that Marx was in favor of the accumulation of capital in private hands. Another small detail that he forgot to retain in his reading of Capital to Semo. State monopoly capitalism is a new phase of development of imperialism. The name of this phase derives from the fact that its essential characteristic is the union, or rather the dialectical unity contradictory between monopolies and the capitalist state. It is not a fusion but the union of two forces, each of which has specific functions. Although ultimately the decisive role remains in the hands of the monopolies, the state becomes a determining factor for their survival and participates decisively in the production, accumulation, and acceleration of the process of monopolization. It only occurs to him to change the word big capital to state monopoly capitalism or imperialism to continue his task of slowing down development. If only Marx lived what these imported or indigenous pedagogues do in his name. State monopoly capitalism is another name for big capital. Semo states that in the last 30 years, Mexico, it has undergone an accelerated process of capitalist industrialization. If Marxist theory wants to keep pace with life, it must start from the understanding of this fundamental fact. It is useless to discuss whether this is a proper development or whether it represents the interests of the masses. What contemporary capitalist development responds to the historical interests of the working class? What becomes necessary, today more than ever, is to study the laws of development of Mexican capitalism, its new forms of organization, its perspectives. Only from there can the foundations of a successful revolutionary strategy emerge. Enrique Semo, Mexican History. Economy and Class Struggles. In his distorted little head, Semo says that, despite the fact that he himself opposed development, the accelerated process of capitalist industrialization in Mexico, what must be done is to study the laws of capitalism to make the revolution, which resembles the Pol Potian revolution, petty bourgeois. Mexico is a country rich in revolutionary traditions, and the current struggle for socialism needs a critical examination of the experiences of 1810 to 21, 185 4 to 67, 1910 to 17 and 1935-39. To the series of revolts, rebellions, incessant internal quarrels of the Mexicans, he calls them revolutionary traditions. This I have been hearing all my life. The fact that there are endless internal skirmishes is not synonymous with revolution. Enrique Semo, Mexican History. Economy and Class Struggles. The economist Enrique Semo shows at every step his racism. Believing himself Marxist, points out that, if the behavior between the sectors of society is determined by the attitude of each of them regarding real or supposed physical differences, that behavior can be called a social relationship of races. The color of the skin and, among Spaniards, the place of birth and lineage, decisively influence the hierarchical location of the individual. A complex system of prejudices distinguishes between Spaniards, Indians, blacks, mestizos, and mulattoes resulting from mixtures. In that case, the concept of race as a social construction is no less effective, because it is biologically false, to describe a social stratification. The supremacy of the Western white man over the Asian, African, and American peoples was established first and foremost by his military superiority from the early 15th century, and later by his economic, political and scientific superiority. From them was born the myth of racial supremacy of the white man. Thus, the Spanish and Portuguese conquerors began the tradition of racial discrimination that would be the distinctive sign of imperialism until well into the 20th century. From the capitalist consolidation in the economy and culture arose the idea that Western Europeans and later, the Americans, formed a master race possessing civilization against other races lacking it. According to this, the white race had the mission of bringing civilization to the savages, and for that they were authorized to use the means that were necessary, the white man's burden. Enrique Semo, Mexico, from the old regime to modernity, reform and revolution. The idea of Semo is so despicable, so miserable, expressed in the previous lines, that whites by the mere sense of feeling superior hate other races or groups of color. I call this the lumpinization of the economy. It is not exclusive to Enrique but to broad social strata that have been permeated by the point of view of the lumpe proletariat. The affinities and disdetunments between people of different characteristics is normal that they are grouped by their characteristics. I give as an example the groupings by ethnicities in New York City. This happens spontaneously without any intervention of the government or any capital. If you look at any cafe you will see that Latinos are grouped with Latinos, Asians with Asians. From there, positive and negative synergies are generated between these groups. Semo Khalef does not learn. The defeat of the socialist experiment in the 20th century does not in any way mean the abandonment of the socialist hypothesis. He calls the bloody terror empire of Russian despot socialism an experiment. He never dared to acknowledge the ineffectiveness of those socialists. I also still cannot know if he left Bulgaria in 1942 because they fled to the West, to Western culture, and did not take refuge, as Jews in the USSR itself. Russia is closer to Bulgaria than to Mexico. We all know what the Soviets also did to the Jews in the USSR and to the population in general, a democide. Just remember the Holodomor. Currently in Russia there are only 140,000 Jews, while in the horrific ultra-imperialist capitalism, mega counter-exploiter live 6 million Jews. Semo recommends the following. In 2012 it is not necessary to call oneself socialist or communist to raise the ideals that are sheltered under this name. That is, to hide socialist political principles, hypocrisy for the sake of gaining ground. They cannot argue that there is political repression or anything like that, only the shame of what they defended before leads them to hide their ideas. Let's go on. Read this paragraph and then comment on it, where Semo wrote that conquest is the initial step in the creation of the first colonial empire in history. Colonialism arises at the same time as capitalism, at the beginning of the 16th century, rather, as an essential part of capitalism from its early stage, and remains in force in the form of dependence, to this day. It is a relationship that is established between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie of Europe that is in transition to capitalism and pre-capitalist societies in less advanced areas of the world. It responds to the insatiable hunger for surplus value transformable into capital by the nascent bourgeoisie, and to the need for money from the absolutist states for their incessant wars and imperial enterprises. The relationship that is established is one of domination, exploitation, and racism. In the colony a new society emerges in which the majority of Spaniards belong to the ruling class and the Amerindians are the exploited. This is the main theme of this book. It had also produced a splendid culture that was almost 3,000 years old. Colonial racism was initially produced in America between Spaniards, Amerindians, and Africans, and then reproduced in the rest of the colonized world, as the basis of the specificity of the power relations between Europe and the populations of the rest of the world. It is not just about the factual differences that were confronted between the conquerors and the vanquished, example skin color, shape and color of hair and eyes, or clothing, instruments, ideas, and social practices. The explanation is different. With the formation of America a new mental category is established, the idea of race. From the beginning of the conquest, the victors began a historically fundamental discussion for the subsequent relations between Spaniards and Creoles, on the one hand, and the Amerindians, on the other, about whether the Aborigines of America had soul or not, in short, whether or not they had human nature. The papacy's conclusion that Amerindians were indeed human did not change the situation much. Enrique Semo, The Conquest, Catastrophe of the Native Peoples. To a natural fact of capitalism, surplus value, Semo turns it into a moral and bad act, to the insatiable hunger for surplus value painting the capitalist as perverse morality against the always goodness of the original peoples of Mexico. He argues that domination, exploitation, and racism occurs. The first is a natural fact, some group has to dominate, and the term exploitation, for the petty bourgeois is synonymous with perversion, being that nowhere in Marx's writings does it come with that perverse moral accent of the Kleinbergers like Semo. Today already updated Semo accuses the Spaniards of racism, being that this fact of the domination of one group over another is a natural fact, typical of the low development of one group with respect to another. He says that the majority of Spaniards belong to the ruling class and the Amerindians are the exploited, which is obvious that this is the case given the great difference in culture between these two groups. The Aztecs did not know the use of the will, nor did they use iron to build, to produce, or for war purposes. The cultural abyss was huge, it could not be otherwise. He considers that the Aztecs or the native peoples of Mexico had produced a splendid culture that was almost 3,000 years old, that is, the Spaniards are degraded, insulted by calling them racists, exploiters, supremacists, while the indigenous people have a splendid culture millenary. When for people with common sense the opposite is the truth, and also for Marx, who considered the Aztecs savages, who used the despotic or hydraulic mode of production. No idol. Enrique Semo is a lousy reader of Marx, a lousy Marxist who fits well into the thinking of a Slav envious of the achievements of Western culture, especially American culture. From what Marx thought about the Aztecs and other groups can be given an idea in the book Ethnological Notes of Karl Marx. End of Part 1.